What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of my favorite moments in gaming, because very recently I've been feeling a bit nostalgic and I thought this might make for a fun video, because I'm currently moving to wrap up Wrath of the Righteous after it finally received its last DLC, which got me thinking about all of the great times I've had with many other games, and it sounded like a good time to pinpoint specific moments of games I really enjoyed that kind of wowed me or simply made me go, whoa. With that in mind, this isn't meant to be a comprehensive list or anything, and they're certainly not in any particular order. I simply wanted to share some cool moments and provide a little more context about specifically why they stood out to me. But I've already mentioned Wrath of the Righteous, so I may as well start with that one. Now, if you follow this channel at all, you'll know that I love this game, and I've played it pretty extensively. But the moment that I knew I was going to play this game a lot, I would say, is the first time I experienced acquiring your mythic power at the end of Act 2 when you make your official choice about which mythic path you'll choose. Now, in Wrath of the Righteous, your protagonist will encounter otherworldly power that can potentially turn them into something else, such as a demon, an angel, a lich, etc. And that initial choice comes to a head at the end of Act 2 when you retake the Citadel at Dresden, which is a frankly long slog of a dungeon, and you've already been through a ton of trials and tribulations up to that point only to acquire this power, while at the same time realizing it's really just the tip of the iceberg. You got a whole lot of game to go and you've only just started, really. But the scene that happens in, that you acquire that power and you pick from any unlocked paths that you've managed to figure out up to that point, realizing just how much these affect the game, probably at least in some part here. For instance, if you got the Azada mythic path, you'll be given an entirely new companion in the form of Ivu, just to name one example. So this right here was simply the moment that I went, oh, I'm going to play this game a lot. And thus, it's always kind of stuck out in my memory. But that's far from the only one, because that brings us to our second entry. You see, for this one, I want to talk about Baldur's Gate 3 and a specific moment about the Dark Urge storyline. However, in order to explain it properly, I have to give you some context about when I experienced this. As somebody who covers this genre of game very, very heavily, chances are you may have seen some of my Baldur's Gate 3 stuff at some point, made all sorts of guides, etc. And as a result of that, Larian sent me over a review copy ahead of the game's release, of course. So there was a few days before the game had its embargo lift and was officially out there for the public, where I was playing the game for myself, but obviously couldn't talk about it with anyone. Which means I experienced a ton of stuff well before anyone else, and in fact, if you're unaware, I was just about the only person who got a review copy of that game that actually managed to beat it at least once before the embargo lifted. And to be fair, it was by the skin of my teeth. I finished it at like 9 p.m. before the embargo lifted the next day. Getting that review out was a lot. But in telling you that, I've hopefully made clear that information was a bit sparse at this time. So I was trying to take in as much as I could information-wise so I could pass it back to the viewer, of course, in the review, noting down all the changes they had made from the early access versions of the game and everything. And as I mentioned, I was playing as the Dark Urge because it was very obvious who that character was meant to be, but I won't get into that here. Now, early on in the game, if you're playing as the Dark Urge, you'll get a visitor at camp, a popular bard who will sing a song with you that people were really hoping would be a companion, which is exactly what I thought was happening when she showed up at camp requesting to join the party. So I was frantically recording and writing this down because I was like, oh my god, they've added this much requested character to the party roster and kind of slipped it in incognito. But if you've played Dark Urge, you probably see where this is going, because the very next day, when your character wakes up, you'll find that you've murdered this woman in your sleep very brutally, which obviously I went from like incredibly excited about recording this as a party member, only to then realize what had actually happened is that Larian pulled the old bait and switch here, because what she actually is simply part of the Dark Urge storyline. But that entire moment, just from the context of doing it with a review copy and not having any of this information and simply being something I discovered on my own, was just an absolute roller coaster of emotion. I can think of very few times where a game just kind of shocked me like that, and I I fell for it completely. I was all in on what they were trying to build up there, only to have those hopes smashed and suddenly have it click what had actually happened, and I just kind of sat there stunned for a minute because they just caught me completely off guard. So that one's kind of ingrained in my memory now as a very humorous interaction. But that's not the only time Larian has crafted a memorable moment that I've enjoyed, because then we have Divinity Original Sin 2, a story about the God-woken chasing the power of the divine in the face of the gods themselves, and of course the void-woken threat. Another one of my favorite games, truth be told, but I also had a moment with this game where I suddenly realized that this was incredible and I was having a fantastic time and I need to know everything about this. So if you've been with the channel a long time and you used to enjoy all of my Divinity lore, this was the moment that I decided that I had to give this game everything I've got. Basically, roughly halfway through the first act of the game, there's a completely optional cave you can go into. If you do go into that cave, there's also a completely optional statue that you may or may not inspect, and doing so will bring you to an area called the Hall of Echoes, a sort of underworld shadow realm type of place that things like the gods typically use to live or simply carry out some of their duties. And it is here that you can encounter whatever god your character has relevance with. If you're playing, say, a lizard, then this will be the goddess of Zoroastissa. If you're playing Losa, it's not a god at all, but rather her, let's say, visitor. And while your character has been hearing voices up to this point, this is the first time you'll interact with the person behind those voices, which is a moment that you might learn that your character is in fact God-woken, a chosen champion of the gods who has a rightful claim to the power of the divine, if, of course, you have the strength to take up the mantle, which leads to the entire rest of the narrative. But this moment, which caught me completely off guard because you don't have to do it at all, it's completely missable, was the moment the game went from where I was having a good time to being a game I simply had to know everything about. And because of that, I will always remember that moment in particular, which is obviously what it's doing here. But for our fourth entry, let's actually switch back to Owlcat Games for a second, and their much more recent title of Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. Another CRPG, this one set in the Warhammer universe, kind of the only game of its kind, really. But another bit of important context here is that up to the release of this game, and of course, as a result of its announcement, I started just kind of absorbing everything I could about Warhammer 40k and learning about it, because up until this game's announcement, I knew next to nothing about the setting. So learning all about Space Marines, the God Emperor of mankind, the Imperium of man, just all of it, was very fresh to me, and the Space Marines in particular obviously kind of being, I would say, the poster children of the setting, but also these genetically enhanced super soldiers of death and destruction, only to then learn that, these can also be corrupted by the forces of chaos and warped into even greater monstrous versions of themselves, forming the Chaos Space Marines, was all really intimidating stuff. But one of the first times I actually saw them in action is as you are fleeing Act 1 of Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, where you'll come face to face with a word bearer in particular, which is a Chaos Space Marine, who makes an incredible entrance right at the end of Act 1 here, and forms what is both a boss fight and a much harder fight than what you've faced up to this point, in what I would consider the game's first real test. So the first time I saw this guy in action in, I believe it was the beta or the alpha, I was honestly a little bit blown away, both figuratively and then quite literally, as he proceeded to decimate my party, and I had to sort of reconfigure some things until I could take this guy out. So it was the first time I had seen a Space Marine in action in a video game for myself, but also it makes this incredible entrance. And then it was a tough as nails boss fight because I kind of just didn't know what I was doing with the game terribly much at that point. So it was just really cool to experience all of that in that one particular moment. And while it's hardly the most shocking thing Rogue Trader really does, it's definitely, I would say, the moment that I think is one of the coolest reveals, if you will, that game has to offer. But we're going to end this video with something a little bit different, and that is actually a moment from Starfield, Bethesda's most recent title, and of course their space RPG, And while clearly not a game for everyone's tastes, this game does have some incredible moments, and there's one in particular I wanted to share just because at the time it happened, again with a review copy before anyone else had gotten to play the game, it just sort of shocked me and shifted my perspective of all sorts of events up to that point. And this is actually the reveal of both the Terramorphs themselves, but also learning where and how they come into being. So slight spoilers for this, I suppose. One of the major quest lines actually, so if you don't want to hear this, skip off. But through one of the faction quest lines, you'll be fighting these monstrosities called Terramorphs that are capable of sort of psychically affecting human beings and disorienting them, and they make an absolute mess of human colonies after about 100 years of living pretty much anywhere. And it's a real problem for space exploration, as you might imagine, because humanity does not have a lot of defenses against these things. And also, they're horrifying to look at. And you'll be researching them as part of one of these faction quest lines, because no one knows where they come from, they just sort of show up. Now, all throughout the game, pretty much, up to this point, you're very likely to have encountered what the game refers to as heat leeches, which are pretty much what they sound like, these big ugly bug creatures that seek out sources of heat. They're everywhere, they're a nuisance, they're kind of like the game's rats, more or less. However, as part of this faction questline, you go to a planet that was ravaged by Terramorphs, only to make an incredibly crazy discovery, which is that heat leeches, once they reach a certain age, or when exposed to a particular sort of accelerant, they suddenly and very violently mutate into full-grown Terramorphs, which is the reason no one's been able to track down where the Terramorphs come from, why they appear so suddenly, and while that might sound tame enough, when I was encountering for the first time what was going on here, the first thing that went through my head when this was revealed was simply that heat leeches are everywhere. You run into them all the time in pretty much human settlements, anywhere around ships and the like, as they kind of seek out star engines, which means they stow away everywhere. And everything just sort of clicked into place with how large of a problem this really was, and that a solution needed to be found fast. And it got me incredibly invested in both the setup and solving the actual problem, which is honestly not something I can say of a lot of Bethesda's writing over the years. And while it's not the only moment from Starfield like that, it's definitely my favorite, which is one of the reasons I would say I enjoyed that game more than most. But that has been 5 of some of my favorite moments in gaming. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, at least half as much as I enjoyed talking about it. But if you did, certainly let me know how you feel about these down in the comments section below, or simply share plenty of your own favorite moments, as this is really just the tip of the iceberg, even for myself, so I can only imagine what the audience will come up with. So obviously that means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.